Thanks very much, Kim. As Kim mentioned, Kim has focused mainly on the global studies and the overview. What I would like to do is to talk a little more about the 10 national studies. These focus on country studies of distortions, use country studies of distortions with information on agricultural and non-agricultural distortions, so defined countries. Key question, what are the implications of the remaining reforms for inequality and poverty? Many of the measures are in place, they're justified in large part on equity and poverty grounds. So what would be the implications of reform? And what is it that drives these results? Well, the 10 national studies, 5 in Asia, 2 in Africa, 3 in Latin America, they draw, as Kim mentioned, very heavily on the expertise of researchers working at IFPRI and the models that have been developed at IFPRI, 4 or 5 of the studies. In fact, depending on timing and how you count, actually involve IFPRI authors. A number of whom are here today. I'm very, very pleased to see you. So, the idea is to have common core experiments and results for national and global liberalization, and to look at impacts on urban and rural households. But the models need to be diverse to reflect country features. As Kim mentioned, it's very, very important to have a residence permit system, the implications of that for China. It must make a lot of sense in most other developing countries that don't have an institution rather than that. But if you're looking, for instance, at South Africa, as James Thurlow and Hérault did, it's very important to have the labour market and the very high rates of unemployment allowed for specific. But at the same time, it's important to have common methodological elements. And as Kim mentioned, the agricultural distortions for 2004 are common. The global linkage model, the terms of trade effects from there, which are relatively small relative to some other models. Micro-simulation modelling of households, the dynamics and interactions with other policies. We need some consistency. What we have here is a really outstanding set of studies. The idea of having them together is that so that the whole will be the sum of the parts. But I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that these are real gems, these studies. There's really lots of insights in all of them. They really warrant careful attention. And I know everyone won't have time to read them in detail with the book that's being passed around to have a look at. I hope that you'll take the time later to read them in more detail. But the China study by Panjai, Tom Patel, Indonesia, Peter Wall, the Philippines, Erwin, Corong, Cesar Cororaton, and John Cockburn, and so on. All of these studies, and really very, very interesting studies that warrant careful and detailed attention. What I'd like to do is to talk about 5 of them, just very briefly to give you an idea of the flavour and some of the subtlety of the results. And David will talk in a moment in more detail. He'll drill down in more detail on the particularly interesting study of Pakistan. Now, the China study, a key element of China's trade regime since the reforms has been a separate processing sector using duty-free imports in the production of exports. That's one of the reasons China's been able to be so successful in the export of goods that involve lots of intermediate imports. If you don't allow for that, and you do liberalization with a standard sort of model, one of the things is you get enormous, spurious increases in exports. You take off the tariffs on intermediate inputs, tariffs that are in fact zero on exports, and suddenly exports become more profitable, and you get quite unrealistic results. So it's really important to have that in China. Another key feature, restricted mobility of labour between agriculture and non-agriculture. That's incorporated using an elasticity of transformation of 2.67, estimated by researchers from the China Center for Economic Research, the Institute for Just and Living, established at Peking University. The residence permit and land tenure rigidities reduce labour mobility. The land tenure, the inability to sell land, historically has been a major disincentive to movement out of agriculture. Households are stratified by income sources. And the key insight from this study is the importance of supporting policies matter, how much supporting policies matter. The percentage point reduction in $1 per day poverty. What you see is that for rest of world liberalisation, there is a reduction. The second, if you look at the initial numbers in the first row, the second row, rest of world liberalisation, you see rural liberalisation of agriculture gives you a reduction in the poverty rate in China, in rural areas. It gives you a slight reduction in urban areas, and 1.2% percentage reduction in the poverty rate nationally. So that's quite a good outcome. Domestic liberalisation, this is one of these quite subtle results, initially surprising, is that if you get slight increases in the poverty rate coming from domestic liberalisation. Now, a part of that is coming from terms of trade. China is a large country. The model, these models have terms of trade. Armington, consequences of liberalisation, and the tariff rates are actually quite low in China. The combined message here, of course, is it's very important for liberalisation. Liberalisation achieved through the global round of liberalisation is particularly helpful for reducing poverty. With agriculture, we have a similar sort of story for rest of world agricultural liberalisation being more helpful than domestic liberalisation, where we get this very, very small increase in the poverty rate. But what's really striking here, the two domestic complementary reforms. You have labour market reform that allows workers to move out of agriculture more freely. Then you see a very large reduction in rural poverty. And the rural poverty rate is the one that really matters in China. That's where nearly all of the poverty is concentrated now. And land reform, a similar story. If it's easier to move out of agriculture, then there are reductions in the poverty rate associated with that. There is a small, in the case of labour market reform, a small increase in poverty, urban poverty, associated with the ability of rural workers to more easily move out of agriculture. So supporting policy is the key message coming from there. Indonesia, Peter War's study, the Wayang model, 10 stylised households, 100 centiles income groups within each household, 65 sectors, a very large model, generates vectors of household incomes and prices, simulations, again, for all distortions and agriculture only, Indonesia, rest of the world, global. Just to look, if we look first at all product liberalisation, the initial poverty rates at the national poverty line, 12%, urban 29%, rural, a classic result, much higher rural than urban poverty. In this case, what we find is unilateral liberalisation gives you small benefits in terms of liberalisation, in terms of poverty reduction, much larger ones from the rest of the world liberalisation, but as in terms of trade improvement. With agriculture, a similar story. The rest of the world liberalisation is much more important in terms of agricultural liberalisation. A result which, of course, is consistent with Indonesia's membership of the Cairns Group in agriculture. Perhaps a deeper policy meaning in there. So agricultural liberalisation, overall global liberalisation is more helpful than unilateral. Rice is a particularly important case in Indonesia. Higher prices of rice help producers. Rice production is a much higher share of unskilled labour than other sectors. So workers benefit from higher wages as a consequence of protection to rice, the current policy of protection to rice. But the benefits of liberalisation to poor consumers outweigh the costs to poor net sellers in terms of the poverty impact. The Philippines, Cororaton, Erwin, Corong, and Cockburn, particularly interesting case. high initial poverty rates, large shares of income spent on food, over 60% amongst the poor. 41 sector model used in the analysis, 4 factors, considers direct versus indirect tax replacement, which is a phenomenon that David will talk about in more detail in the context of Pakistan. And then the micro-simulation model, in the case of the Philippines, as changes in employment status associated with liberalization. Another phenomenon that's very important in South Africa, the South Africa study. Poverty and inequality, the impacts of liberalization. And here we look at world agriculture, the far right column, and we see falls in poverty associated with global agricultural liberalization. And it turns out global agricultural liberalization is the most important in this particular study. Global liberalization generally is helpful. With agriculture, we're actually domestic reforms, interestingly here, domestic reforms alone are not terribly helpful in terms of poverty reduction. In fact, you see increases, small increases in poverty associated with domestic liberalization. So again, a case where it would be very desirable to see liberalization occurring in the context of global liberalization based on the results from this study. The South Africa study, Hérault and James Thurlow. James will answer all the detailed questions that you'd like to throw at him on this study. Enormously detailed national model, 110 activities, including 17 agriculture, 12 food, unemployment, such a hugely important phenomenon in South Africa, model for unskilled and semi-skilled labour with a fixed nominal wage. Changes in commodity prices, household tax rates, factor returns, employment levels past the household. Household-specific price indexes used. A selection model for employment status, formal subsistence agriculture, informal, unemployed. These details being so hugely important in the case of South Africa. And one of the important elements of findings from the study is that employment rises with liberalisation, rises rather than falls with liberalisation in South Africa in the context particularly of its labour market institutions. The poverty results for South Africa, liberalisation, if we just divide into rest of the world and domestic, what we find is that liberalisation in the rest of the world is helpful in terms of reducing poverty rates at $1 per day, both at the national level, rural and urban. Agriculture liberalisation accounts for most of that. If you just look at agricultural liberalisation in the second column, almost all of it is driven there. When we look at domestic liberalisation, the results as well, domestic liberalisation rather, the results are actually larger than they are for world liberalisation in the context of South Africa. I think in this case, a lot of the explanation there is the link between the reforms and the labour market linkages in South Africa. Brazil, Joaquim Bento de Souza Filho and Mark Horridge have a model, 27 GE models. In this case, regional diversity is hugely important. There are 27 CGE models, linked models, one for each state in Brazil. 41 sectors, of which 11 are agricultural. The CGE and household models run together. The finding from this model, poverty declines with global trade liberalisation. But the most important driver being liberalisation of agriculture in the Red Sea of the world. Again, no surprise that Brazil is very actively involved in the Cairns Group. Impacts on inequality and poverty findings here. We look at the Gini and poverty headcount. Rest of world agriculture, as I mentioned, quite important. The biggest reductions in the table are really coming from rest of world agriculture, liberalisation of agriculture, and the rest of the world creating market access opportunities for Brazil. Rest of the world non-agriculture, slightly helpful. Brazil Agriculture, some small additional benefits. Resort non-agriculture, a relatively small story coming from there, remembering that barriers are overall reasonably low in that context. And the total at the bottom line, and the sum, in this case more or less, the sum of the parts giving us the total benefit in both in the Gini ratio and in the poverty head count. Also, 10 national studies. If you look at the averages, as Kim mentioned, you see the average finding across the 10 national studies is for an average reduction in poverty, extreme poverty coming from agriculture, an average reduction, a larger average reduction from merchandise liberalization overall. As we've seen by looking at the individual studies, you do see some diversity there, which gives you some important additional insights into the nature of the problem. Key conclusions: trade liberalization impacts on poverty and inequality are usually favourable. The benefits are usually greater if own trade reform is combined with reforms by trading partners, which makes the case for liberalising, pushing forward with global trade liberalisation. Interactions with other policies are often important. The tax replacement, as we'll see in David Gordon's presentation, frequently matters a great deal. Labour market rigidities can create a lot of vulnerability, and sometimes, as in the case of South Africa, some opportunities for greater benefits from reform. And then complementary policies and aid to trade can be very, very helpful in ensuring favourable poverty outcomes.